Okay, so let's begin the second part of our class with a video. So I'm going to show you guys a short video, and while you watch this video, it's about basically language learning. So when you're watching it, try to think about what we have discussed so far last Monday. It could be related to the definition of language, what it involves, or it could be also related to the purpose of language learning that we have discussed so far, or something called motivation. So let's try to take a look at them together. And after we watch it, we'll debrief about the video together.
我的姓是 Sheldon.
No, it's 我的名字是 Sheldon.
我的名字是 Sheldon.
What's this?
That's what you did. I assumed as in a number of languages that the gesture was part of the phrase.
Well, it's not.
Why am I supposed to know that? As the teacher, it's your obligation to separate your personal idiosyncrasies from the subject matter.
You know, I'm really glad you decided to learn Mandarin.
Why?
Once you're fluent, you'll have a billion more people to annoy instead of me.
Hey, Medu Luitza.
You just called Leonard a syphilitic donkey.
My apologies, Leonard. I'm only as good as my teacher. Show me your citrus peels. 给我干你用的铅笔. Show me your citrus peels. 给我干你用的铅笔. Show me.
Sheldon?
哎呀，吓死我了!
I'm sorry. Look, do you have a second?
A second what? Pair of underwear?
2 seats right there.
成熟社会. 谢谢. Otsus alido. BT Zainar. BT.
请干见 BT 后，快走快走！
这不是六丁教的这。
Crazy man, call the police!
No, 不必带给图书馆。BT 在哪儿？慢药在我床上，很多慢药。哎呀！
Okay, so we have briefly watched an interaction, and I don't know if you know this show called Big Bang Theory. And this main character, Sheldon, he's trying to learn the language Mandarin, right? While we saw the video, what were some of the things that you noticed? Any thoughts related to the definition of language, or it could be about the language learning process that we have talked about? Anything that you noticed that seems to be similar to what you have experienced? Anything? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I believe what he done after trying to learn the language with his friend, he's trying to apply what he learned with the people that he saw, like the Asian people. He thought that there might be Chinese, so he tried to have conversation with them. So this is a very good broadcast for anyone who's trying to learn language. Apply the language, not just learn it at home, but try to make it a center in your life, like a center of your daily life.
Yes, definitely. It seemed like Sheldon was, when I saw this, I was like, this guy's genius in a way, because he is not really fluent in the language, but be able to construct those sentences, that seems to come from a lot of courage, but also at the same time, as you mentioned, he seems to be wanting to communicate with other people, although it did not really make sense to the others. Another very interesting point you pointed out was that it seems like Sheldon was making assumptions about who the other person was and what other person was using as their native language. So just assuming that, oh, this person seems to be an Asian person, so he decides to use Chinese with them. It seems like these people were in fact Chinese users because they showed that confusion in their expression by saying like that does not make sense. But still, I think that also shows how we interpret who the target speakers are based on appearance. Yes, that's another very interesting point. Anything else? Yes.
Although Sheldon
Mhm.
tried to communicate, but he had the wrong context every time.
Mhm.
I think trying to apply what he learned in real life in context of language learning is very essential. And I think he did wrong though, but I think it is a very good point to teach us that trying is very important.
Yes, as Kyo just mentioned, I feel like Kyo, right?
Yes.
So I think that practice makes perfect. We have that expression already. It's however, if you don't speak it out, a lot of the times you might not even try and not be able to learn from those experiences. So I do feel like a lot of the language learning involves bravery. Like you need to have the courage to put yourself out there, trying to play with the language and see how people respond to it, right? That's also a very important attitude that as language learners that they need to have. Yes. So I think that all of you have this a very good idea of what's going on until this point. So let's move on to the next part of our textbook. So according to the textbook, if you have been able to take a look at chapter one, and what you'd be able to find is that learning at a lot of the times is considered to be an acquisition. I think we talked about acquisition coming from the verb acquire. You are acquiring something, adding something to your previous knowledge. It's also the retention of information and skills. What this means is that it needs to be there for a longitudinal time in order for your learning to happen. If you forget things like immediately afterwards without any retention, it will be very difficult to say that you learned something, right? So it needs to stay for at least a while. And it also involves this idea of storage system, memory, and cognitive organization. That is the reason why a lot of the times learning involves brain study too. Like we look into the brain, what functions the brain has that manages or somewhat is related to the learning. Moving on to number four, it is the application of active, conscious focus and also subconscious attention. This is an interesting part where we are talking about attention. So people say that in order to acquire language, you need to you need to attend to the specific details. For example, you need to pay attention. However, it says conscious focus and subconscious focus. What do you think that means? So consciousness means that you are aware, right? You're cognitively aware and you're trying to, let's say, memorize that this is a desk. Desk is spelled as DESK. But unconscious or subconscious attention, what do you think those refer to? It could be related to somewhat of an immersive setting. Let's say that you go into, let's say you go abroad for traveling and you see people using a certain word and you seem to be aware that, oh, so people seem to use, let's say, hello, but instead of hello, they say hola, but it seems like you get immersed in the setting and just naturally learn the language. In the reason why I pointed to that is because some of the methods that people have developed later on was focusing on the subconscious attention. That people felt that we would learn better if we are in a very natural, relaxed setting. And so people, later I'll talk about this in more detail, but people play music when you're learning language in the background. So you are very relaxed and learn the language as if at a very stable state of mind. So that is one of the reasons why we have this idea of subconscious attention there. Moving on to number five, it seems to be relatively permanent, but subject to forgetting. I think we all have this experience, right? The things that you learned, let's say 10 years ago, we can't really claim that you still remember every single detail. It's natural, and it's almost related to human instinct, I guess, to human survival, so that you be able to forget things. So that's also connected to learning. Number six, it is the result of practice, perhaps reinforced practice. Do you guys understand the expression of reinforced practice? It could be related to that, but when you're talking about reinforced, it usually relies on the response of others. Let's say that you said, can I have a cup of tea, for example, and you see the other person passing you tea. In that case, you get the response which you wanted to get, and that provides reinforcement. Sometimes you might not be able to get that, and you might get a wrong response. That would in turn also let you know that, okay, I guess I said something wrong, or I guess that this is not the appropriate practice in this particular context. So that's also connected to this idea of reinforced practice. So it's not just a one-time thing. It is repeated. It is based on the response of others. Overall, learning itself is a change in behavior. I think this is also a very strong message that from learning, you get to be able to change the way that you think, you act, or you interact with others. All these things would be involved in learning. So learning is actually changing. I think that's another argument that we'd be able to make. Okay, so let's move on to our textbook. Not textbook specifically, but from pages like 7 to 9 of this textbook, you may have found these following expressions. I just pulled them out here. And it says that it makes these arguments about like if you perceive language as a phenomenon, or the author says if you think language is essentially cultural and interactive, or if, like B.F. Skinner, you view learning as a process of something. If you take a look at these sentences, you'll be able to find that it all starts with if, right? I think this is another thing that I talked about during week 1 about how when we are viewing learning or learning language, we have to understand that it comes from a particular point of view. It's a perspective. I will be constantly mentioning throughout the semester that there is no one answer to learning. Okay, so in this case, I think the author was trying to highlight that the learning process or the beliefs related to the learning is pretty much dependent on your own personal view. So if you think this way or if you perceive it, so it's very conditional. So keeping that in mind, we are going to move on to the next part of our textbook, the chapter 1, which goes much more deeper into this idea of perspectives on second language acquisition. Here in chapter 1, it nicely divides them up into 3 different perspectives. These are not all, but it provides you with a general understanding of 3 different big ideas related to learning. So what I want you to do is take some time and try to, on your laptop or on your note or somewhere, try to complete this table and try to summarize the concepts or approaches from the 3 perspectives on second language acquisition. I understand the answer is already there on the PDF file if you have downloaded, but try to go back to the textbook, try to write down some of the details or the examples that you can make a connection to. So I'm going to give you guys about 5 minutes to do this, and we'll talk about each one of them together. I want you to do this together with a partner. So try to talk with your neighbor, say hi, and I believe you guys can work on the completion of this table for about 5 minutes, and I'll bring you guys all back into the whole discussion. Okay, so let's start the discussion. Okay, so why don't we talk about these together now? Let's go from one to another. Just one thing that I noticed was that some of you have access to the book, but some of you don't. As I mentioned during week 1, you're going to pretty much go through all the chapters, so it would be best if you get the book. And it seems like the online version is available. However, the online version is a different edition. So the structure and some of the examples and content might have, in fact, changed. So if you still want to rely on the online, which is the 5th edition probably, I think, you might want to make sure that you compare it with the actual book and see what you're missing or what's the same. But I think some chapters are different, if I remember correctly. So that's that. If you haven't read the book yet, make sure after I know that we have just started, but make sure you review each one of them so that you'll be able to comprehend the content more specifically because it's going to help you with the discussion in the class as well. Okay, so we are going to go through the timeline in a very big chunks for today. So first of all, we are going to start off with this idea of structural linguistics. When you hear the word structure, it perhaps reminds you of the language definition, which was similar to systematic, right? Something that has a structure to it, and also something called behavioral psychology. So this idea was first introduced during the 1940s and 50s, so a long, long time ago before you guys were born. So how structural linguists view language and also language learning was, first of all, it was pretty much describing human languages and also identifying the structural characteristics, including the syntactical structure, where the subject, the verb, and the object are positioned, for example, looking at the trees. So these were all related to the structure and pretty much not doing any of the intervention, but pretty much describing how people were using the language. So it examined only something that was observable. It was not really going in depth about what was not being observed, but it was simply looking at the overtly, obviously observable data. Therefore, it ignored any mentalistic theorizing, what was going inside your mental. That was pretty much ignored. Something including like unobservable guesses, hunches, and intuitions about language. So it was looking at, try to think about it as looking at the data that was verbally produced, not something that was going on inside your head. So it was looking at something that was obviously observable. So in this vein, it's pretty much viewed language as something that can be broken down because it had that system and also the structure down into small units that can be described scientifically and also contrasted and recombined to form the whole. So in this way, language was pretty much understood, I would say, like math problems, right? It was understood in a very scientific way that everything could be dissected, divided up into pieces, and put them together. So while when we are talking about the structural linguistics and also the behavioral psychology, in that field, they pretty much try to answer the what questions. What was being said? How and what was the structure, or what was the let's say the order of the words, for example. So it was looking at the surface level of the language. So here in this case, the key questions was to look at what are the best drills and pattern practice that we can have our students to better learn the language. So that was the main questions that these people had. But then, so as I mentioned that these were in the 1940s and 50s, you can imagine that it did not really stay long because what could have been the limitations or benefits. All these ideas do have both pros and cons. So I think we'd be able to talk about both here. Yes.
For me, I think like so benefit because like we can use like structural drills and practice. So it will help students like for beginner to learn grammar, but for limitations because it's too much practice on grammar. So they don't have like the real practice in communication situation.
Yes. So I think pure point, right? Yes. So what she just described was that actually the movement here about how at the very beginning, therefore, we thought that, oh, language learning, you just memorize the rules, memorize the syntactic structure, memorize the phonology, memorize how it is spoken, the sound. A lot of kids nowadays still learn phonics, right? And one of the reasons that is that that has its own benefits. So people at the very beginning stage might actually do a lot of practice, doing a lot of drilling, like Sheldon did during the video. He was pretty much imitating the sound over and over again to make it his own. So similar to that, I think that does have that benefit. But as mentioned, the limitation, one of them could be that it lacks a communicative style. We have those pragmatics that we talked about on Monday about what was it? The pragmatics of the use of the language. We can use the same I'm fine to describe so many different things, right? So those could be lost in this case. In the structural linguistics, you look at the expression I'm fine. So here we have the subject I, and we also have the verb, the be verb am, and we also have fine to refer to this the syntactical structure. But in real life, I'm fine could be meant to say that I'm fine, really fine, but you can also say like I'm not really fine, depending on your tone, right? So those could be the limitation related to the structural linguistics. So then in the 1960s, so when you look at this, you'll be able to find a lot of these ideas jump from one to another. It is grounded, or it is very relative in this sense. In 1960s, we have this idea of generative. This generative is not generative AI, okay? Generative linguistics and also cognitive psychology, which comes in to describe it's still describing language, but it is trying to achieve the level of descriptive adequacy, whether it is adequate enough and how it aims to describe what's going on related somewhat to the performance. So here, one of the person who provides a very insightful idea is related to Saussure, who provides this idea of parole and length. Here, parole refers to the performance, what you perform. But so basically, the structural linguist would in fact be paying attention to the performance, right? So just what is being performed. But again, in this generative linguistics in the 1960s, talk about the competence. So what is going on inside that person? So not only looking at the output, but also the knowledge of the language that this learner holds. So cognitive psychologists questioned the behaviorist attempts to oversimplify these complex psychological phenomena. So right before we were looking at something that was observable only, right? Looking at the behaviors, whether the person understood it, was able to produce sound of it or not. But in this case, the cognitive psychologists went a little bit farther than that and also attempted to discover the underlying motivations and also the deeper structures of human behavior using a more of a rational approach. So while the structural linguistics paid more attention to the what questions, now we are talking about the why this happens, why people use it this way. So it has shifted a little bit from what was more of a surface level understanding of the language used to something that is a little bit deeper. So it's not really the whole iceberg, but it's went a little bit deeper into under the water. Then the next idea has to do with constructivism. So here, constructivism is again connected to the ideology of post-structural theoretical positions. So it moved from structuralism to post-structuralism. So when the ideology of the society changes, the learning ideologies also kind of aligns with what's going on in the society. I think that's the way that you can look at it. So another interesting point, I think, is that the current society that where we live in, you'll be able to imagine how it's going to evolve and also how our understanding of learning evolves as well. So I think that's the more of a very interesting question that we have. But in this case, in the constructivism, it looks at not only the linguistic, psychological, but also it's added with the sociological paradigms. So as you can see, it gets a bit bigger, right? This understanding. Initially, the structural linguistics paid only attention to the linguistic part. The next comes in to look at the psychological part, and now we're adding it with the sociological part. So as you can see, it gets a little bit bigger and more specific. So that's why it looks like when I ask you to describe language, the definition seems to be all encompassing everything, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why we are adding things that we start to be aware of. When we're talking about constructivism, we can divide them into two different ideas. One is called cognitive constructivism. The other one is called social constructivism. If you look at cognitive, it's related to cognition, right? So therefore, it goes on to talk about the individual's personal processing. So in this case, cognitive constructivism, ideas are constructed by individuals, not in groups, but individuals through a personal process. However, social constructivism, in this case, ideas are constructed through social interaction. So you learn it from it be interacting in a social relationship. And also cooperative learning with teachers and other students. So it's slightly different, as you can see. The cognitive constructivism pretty much focuses on the individual self only. But the social constructivism looks at learning as essentially a social action. And I think that's one of the reasons why, remember at the very beginning, I asked you guys to share your opinion, share your thoughts with your partner, right? The reason why I asked you to do that is also connected to this idea of social constructivism, where we believe that people can learn from one another. That's called peer learning as well. We talk quite a lot about peers in learning, and that peer could be somebody who is at the same level or who could be lower, it could be higher, it does not really matter. So we are going to talk about that later on too. Okay, that's something I'll talk about later. So nowadays we pay more attention to the social aspect, and we also have something called social cultural perspective in language learning. And that's something that is much more connected to identity, as you can tell, right? So when we're talking about brain development, I think that that's where it's more grounded in the structural I'm sorry, not structural. The brain, when we're talking about the cognition, and when we're talking about identity or social interaction, that's more connected to the later approach. Or communicative competence, that's also connected to that. So according to the cognitive constructivism, learners must individually discover and transform complex information, taking a more active role for students in their own learning. So learners taking more of the active role in their own individual journey. However, on the right-hand side, you'll be able to find that social constructivism essentially views individuals to be engaged in social practices on a collaborative group or on global community. So I think we talked about being able to communicate with others, right? We talked about this before. So that idea comes from the social constructivism. So this is another concept that I might be able to briefly introduce to you. You might have seen this or heard about something called ZPD. Has anyone heard of it? No? That's fine. Okay. ZPD is called the zone of proximal development. So this idea is almost like one of the central concepts when we're talking about social cultural theory of language education, and also connected deeply into the constructivism. We are talking about the zone of development that the learners can perform. So ZPD looked at learners as not as is at that point, but you also looked at the learners with some rooms for potential development. So you're looking at the learners. It's also connected to this assessment, language assessment, which is called dynamic assessment. As you can tell from the terminology, dynamic. You're not assessing students with, let's say that you take a test, so you take a midterm, and that's it usually, right? However, the ZPE pretty much looks at, let's say, what you can do with the help of others. And afterwards, so let's say that I ask you to do a task by yourself, and it seems like you are not able to do it by yourself, but you get the help of other people. So that's the zone. So based on the help of others, you go return to the task by yourself and see whether you'll be able to do it yourself now. So then that tells us about the growth that you'll be able to perform later on. So you're pretty much capturing the growth of the space of the zone itself of the learners rather than just looking at them at one temporal moment. So that's a little bit different when we're talking about social the ZPD. The important part when we're talking about ZPD is the other person. Here we talk about the more knowledgeable other. You might have experience in your own classroom or even in this university where you are you have to do a lot of group work, right? Have you thought about why we do a lot of group work? Because professors want you to, or usually we see the benefit of group work to be gaining something from other peers. How many of you think that you can gain from interacting with somebody who is more talented than you are or more skilled than you are? You, some people. How many of you think that you can also learn from those who are not better than you? Some people. Okay, good. Well, that's a very welcoming response. Okay, so initially, a long time ago, people have thought that we only need to learn from teachers, like who have all the proficiency, who has already the mastery of the language. However, soon afterwards, people started to investigate the peer interaction, and it seemed like a lot of the times we have the framework also called teaching by learning. So no, sorry, learning by teaching. So when you are, let's say, in peer interaction, you are teaching other people who are not really knowledgeable in that, let's say, topic one compared to you, but still you'd be able to further develop your ideas. And also through interaction, you'd be able to both grow. So that's the idea also connected to this ZPD and also the importance of these other people. So yes, so that's something I just really wanted to touch upon. And again, that involves social interaction, so it goes well with the social constructivism. So Vygotsky's concept of the ZPD, it pretty much provides the unity of learning and development. And again, as I mentioned over and over again, social interaction is seen as foundational and also very crucial to cognitive development. So this idea of social interaction was somewhat, I think, a lot of people were worried during COVID, for example, because we thought that learners without the social skills might be losing a lot of elements in learning. So that might be also related to this idea. It also rejected the notion of predetermined stages. What we mean by predetermined stages is that not looking at students with the potential to grow, you're just labeling the students as what they have performed previously. So it rejects that idea. We also have this Vygotsky and Bakhtin, they're both Russian philosopher, while long time ago. And it overlaps with this emphasis on the social cultural dimensions of second language acquisition. I think Bakhtinian perspective is also a very difficult. He is a philosopher who I really, really like, but his books are very difficult to read. But all the idea that they came up with was during the Soviet Union. So they do talk quite a lot about being able to voice your ideas, interact with others, confront the authoritative discourse, which means that going against what seems to be the dominant ideas of the society. So we'll come back to this. Somehow you might get an impression that this is quite a lot, but we will go through them in more detail in the upcoming weeks. So I hope we'll be able to better understand them later on. Piaget's theory of learning is also very famous theory. Some of you might have heard of Piaget, and it talks about the stages of the development setting, which sets a precondition of readiness for learning. So it looks at the learning and not, let's say, not a disconnected stages, but something that seems to be flowing from the past to the current moment. It also talks about the importance of individual cognitive development as a relatively solitary act, but these might come back to us later on in the later chapters. So try to look at it somewhat as an introduction to, or almost like an overview of what's going to come along. So this is also in the textbook, and you'll be able to find that it's nicely organized with what we have so far discussed about, and you'll be able to go review it one by one. So for today, I'm going to introduce to you two of the methods that was introduced in the chapter, and somewhat goes well with what we have so far described about it in three different perspectives. First of all, we have something called grammar translation method. How do you think grammar translation method was carried out? Can anyone imagine what it might be like? It's kind of there already, but. So as you can tell from the wording, grammar, translation, what do you think people usually learn about? In this method, the emphasis is on grammar, yeah, grammar learning. And also it uses translation, right? It means that you are translating. I think we are somewhat accustomed to this idea where you have a sentence and you translate it. And still, we use that idea in like test taking. Your professor might give you a sentence and ask you to translate it in the English language or Japanese, whatever. So we still have that somewhat of a approach left or lingering around. But here, the principal's idea is that, first of all, it tries to understand and appreciate written literature. So it's not spoken, as you can tell. It's grammar, translation. Translation, not interpretation, translation. Translation is written, interpretation is spoken. Okay, so in this case, it was based to write and learn the language through grammar. Learning is facilitated through comparison and translation between the L1 and L2. This seems to be somewhat effective still because let's say that you go abroad and look at the menu, okay? So sometimes it might be in the menu in the target language, and also underneath it, it might have translation in English, right? And when you start comparing it, you might be able to find, oh, let's say that there's a menu of pizza. And it starts with like cheese, 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 cheese. Like there are the repeated ingredients. And if you look at the language, then you might be able to just kind of tell, okay, so it seems like cheese in this Italian is, I don't know what cheese in Italian is, probably cheese. Yeah, not latte, but anyways, so you can kind of do that already. So it's similar to that idea of method. So here in this case, the emphasis is on writing. We are not talking about speaking at all, only writing. And also the reading skills, right? So you'd be able to comprehend and write. So it might, you can definitely assume, I mean, just imagine how people might have with the difficulty in speaking in that case, right? You might be able to write your ideas, but not be able to communicate with others using the verbal language. Here, in this particular method, L1 is used quite often. You might have in this, in KAIS, for example, I don't know how many of you are taking English classes, but if you're an undergrad and if you have to take English classes, we use, in a lot of Korean universities, we have something called EMI, English as the medium of instruction. So you are using the target language to learn the language. So, however, in the grammar translation method, which was long, long time ago, they actively use the first language. So I think I learned English in my junior high school years using Korean. So the teacher was Korean. We were mainly using Korean, but we were using the English textbooks. So that's somewhat of very similar related to grammar translation, although we did learn somewhat of the speaking skills too. So here in this case, grammar is taught deductively. So you're being taught very efficiently about this is the grammatical rules and let's apply it, right? So that's how it went. And also it did pay a lot of attention to the accuracy of the language, whether you spelled it right. I think we did a lot of spelling tests, right? So that's also connected to this idea. In this type of classroom, the teacher is usually in charge. The teacher provides the knowledge to the students, and the students just simply receives the knowledge that the teacher provides. So it's very passive in a way that we describe it. Some of the techniques that we talk about in grammar translation methods include things like reading comprehension. I think we talked about reading, right? So we have a lot of reading comprehension, whether you were able to get the main idea, were able to find places where the coherence was not really making sense, for example, the reading comprehensions were there. We also had the translation of literary passages. We talked about like exam where you have to translate. Memorization is also important. So all these came out were highlighted during the grammar translation method. You can still find some elements remaining, as you can tell, that we still are somewhat familiar with some of the ideas, but something additional elements that came later on. So as you can see, there are still some benefits that we can be able to get from these methods, and some things that we can complement with other methods. So the next one is called audio-lingual method. As you can tell, audio-lingual, right? Audio refers to the sound, right? So therefore, this one is pretty much based on the oral skills, whether you be able to do the speaking and listening, right? So it's very dramatic when you're looking at these methods. It jumps from one to the extreme end, and you can in fact find a lot of the methods coming in between later on. So in this case, learners use the target language communicatively. So you're pretty much speaking at a lot of the times, practicing a lot in the speaking and listening classes. The features that are involved include things like new vocabulary structures that are presented through dialogues. So as we just mentioned, in grammar translation method, you might have just learned. So these are the expressions when you want to greet another person. Hello, hi, right? And in the grammar translation, you will be writing it down, practicing the spelling, right? However, in the audio lingual method, you'll be able to hear the dialogue, let's say, the interaction between two people. And then from the dialogue, you'll be able to learn, okay, so hello is the expression that you use when you greet another person. The target language should be used in the classroom, therefore. So you have to speak the language to learn the language. Here, in this case, learning occurs through imitation and repetition. So when you think about this, Sheldon's idea of learning the repeating while listening to the tape is pretty much related to the audio lingual method, right? So although he is not really interacting with other people, in the interacting later on in the video, but in the middle when he was just repeating, listening to the earphone, that's pretty much related to the audio lingual method. But usually in the classroom, in this case, the teacher provides accurate input for learners to imitate. Why do you think we have this emphasis on accurate input?
Because it is the only way that we can learn.
Yes. So the idea here in audio-lingual method is imitation, right? If the input is incorrect, then your imitation is also going to be incorrect. Therefore, in audio-lingual method, the teacher's accuracy is very, very important. The teacher needs to provide the students with accurate pronunciation, for example, or accurate discourse or accurate reading, for example, in order for students to imitate that. So that could be one of the reasons why. So the student does a lot of repetition, and the competition is there because some of the activities could in fact include competition among students. You can ask students to do, let's say, to repeat after one another, using a quiz, for example, and some of the drills related to contraction. Can anyone think about the contraction drills, what this might in fact refer to? I think you might have seen this or heard about it in commercials. I think there were quite funny ones where people say, you shouldn't say, what are you, no, what are you doing? Like you should say, what you're doing. Like, contraction is a better way to communicate. It's more natural. Even textbooks nowadays, we have those sections where it talks about the contraction of the thumb. Right? Because this audio lingual method is about the speaking and listening, the contraction is also related to the production of the sound in a very natural way. So the contraction drills, I think like will gonna, like how students practice those, that's related to the contraction drill. Okay, finally, we have one last thing about communicative language teaching. I think that's related to the communicative competence that we briefly talked about. This is more recent, I would have to say. Around year 2000, were you guys born in 2000? No? Wow. Okay. 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 I think I've been teaching. How long have I been teaching? It's 2026. So I think I've been teaching for about 15 years so far. And when I started teaching, I remember that some students did not know Sandra Bullock. Do you know her? Oh, okay, you guys know. Okay. So a lot of the actresses that I knew, for example, or the songs, or the events, like we were able to still share it. Like 2000. Do you guys know? Have you guys watched? No, no, probably not. I get the answer myself about the 2002 World Cup. Okay. Yeah. Anyways, so why was I talking about this? Oh yeah, I was talking about 2000. Okay. So around year 2000, what happened was when I was educated long time ago, we were more familiar with the grammar translation, especially with Korean students. And then the new government came in and said that, okay, so it seems like a lot of students have good English scores, but it seems like they can't communicate. So they can't talk with other people from around the world. So that ended up with a policy where it's called the TT policy, where what was it? It's like teaching English. I forgot the acronym, but anyways, it was pretty much bringing all these native English teachers from outside Korea, bringing them in so that the students would be able to get more of an exposure to English. So the reason behind that was somewhat related to this idea of communicative competence, because it seemed like a lot of the students were very good at doing a lot of the testing related to English scores, like grammar translation. They were able to get the grammatical rules, use appropriate vocabulary. However, in reality, when they're confronted people coming from other places, they seem to be not able to, in fact, use English. So this is somewhat overlaps with that idea that it's not enough by just repeating what or imitating what was just said, but it's more important to use the language in communication. So that's where this communicative language teaching came out, where it enhances learners' communicative competence in verbal and nonverbal interaction. So now we start to see nonverbal interaction, right? People started to learn about making eye contact. This is a funny story, but when I was growing up, I don't know, when you get scolded by your parents, let's say, I hope that you guys still have that experience, right? When your parents scold you on something that you did wrong, do you make eye contact or do you not make an eye contact? Never? Oh, never? Okay. I thought making eye contact was so difficult because I remember that with my mom, when she said something to me, if I don't look at her, then she goes like, why are you not listening? So, and when I do look at her, it seems like I'm rebellious, right? So I thought that, oh, making eye contact was so difficult. And eye contact, in fact, is very how should I describe it? Very sensitive, right? Because let's say depending on even the word that we have for eye contact, it differs. We can use the expression like gaze, stare, all these different verbs. And you're just looking at somebody, but some people might say, what are you staring at? Right? And get into a fight. Or you might actually look at somebody and I don't know, like love relationship might happen eventually. Who knows? Like a romantic relationship. But so here in communicative language teaching, we started talking about all these nonverbal behaviors. One funny note was that my academic advisor once told me she was American, and she said that she got an email from an international student, and she knew that it was very benign. It was like very innocent mistake. But it was during the Valentine's Day, and this male student at the end said XOXO. Do you guys know what XOXO means? Is this also not an NC thing? It's called hugs and kisses. So when she received it, she was like, oh, this is not really adequate coming from a student to a professor, right? Suddenly XOXO, like. So that's also this idea of communicative appropriacy. When we're talking about whether something is appropriate or not, it's not just the language itself, but how you use it to whom and in what kind of context. So in this case, it focuses on the meaning of communication rather than the simple structure. Whether you have said it in the right sentence without any grammatical mistake, that's not important here. What kind of underlying message were you able to send to the other person, and were you able to achieve the goal? That's more important in this case. Some of the features that are included, first of all, fluency is valued more than accuracy. It does not necessarily matter that you miss an out article. Some of you have talked about it in your language learning reflection, but missing an out article does not really cause any problem in this case. It is more towards whether you were able to reach your communicative goal. Learners are also given tasks to complete using language rather than studying the language. What this means is rather than studying what this language structure is about, it's more related to how you use the language. Are you able to use the language, perform it, the performance element? In this case, the teachers facilitate learners' language and language learning and provide opportunities for communication. And in this environment, learners take more of an active role in their language learning. You can imagine, right? The learners are more actively engaged and practicing and trying out different expressions. So some of the techniques that you can think about include things like interviews, group discussions, jigsaw tasks, a lot of games, and again, competitions also that might be in relation to the games up here. Okay, so I think that's it for today's class. This is instruction related to your weekly reflection number 1. So you can find this on your PDF again. I think some of you already have downloaded the PDF file from the weekly, the PowerPoint. And the weekly reflection number 1, I want you guys to describe activities from your own previous language learning experiences that either illustrate a behavioral perspective of second language acquisition, cognitive perspective, or a constructivist perspective. We looked at the 3 perspectives today, right? So you can, I think you have the option of highlighting one and go more into detail. Or you can think about your own and think that, oh, I think it was a combination of these 2, and you'd be able to describe that more in detail. So for each example, you can choose 1 or 2 or 3. It does not really matter. But for each of them, try to explain how it really reflects the theoretical perspective. Not just saying that I think this was, let's say, constructive perspective because I think it is. That's not really a good claim, right? So you might want to back it up with some of the things that we have talked about in class, and also you can refer to the chapter as well. Some of you have questions about the formatting requirements, as I mentioned before, maximum 2 pages, double spaced, and 12 points, I guess, will be fine. Just the normal standard that we use times New Roman or something else that you find it amusing to yourself, I think will be fine. So that is due until next week. And other than that, I think that's it for today's week. Next week, we're going to move on to chapter 2. So again, make sure to get access to the book at least. And if you have time, make sure you read it before attending the class. And I guess that's it. Thank you, everyone.